In the summer of 2013, I wrote an article for the Canadian Criminal Law Association Journal. It begins this way: the rule of law is a metaphor that finds its modern origins in the political poetics of the 16th century European philosophers. In Canada, it is now a constitutional axiom, as Justice Weyler and Sharp described in the following oft-quoted passage from Lalonde versus Ontario. Quote, "Constitutionalism and the rule of law are cornerstones of the Constitution and reflect our country's commitment to an orderly and civil society in which all are bound by the enduring rules, principles, and values of our Constitution as the supreme source of law and authority." Unquote. If this were the only relevant question for which the rule of law was to be applied, then the pride we take in our democracy would be justified. However, the ghost of metaphor and the antecedent injustice that gave rise to the poet's imagination have never been laid to rest, not by God nor the Constitution. Canadian jurists and lawmakers have to admit that principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law are not the real foundation on which this nation-state of Canada has been built. While most citizens of the state are ignorant of Canadian history, judges, lawyers, and academics should not be. And if they are ignorant of the colonial underpinnings of this country, they should be defrocked and disbarred. In doing research for this particular lecture, I ran across a picture of the super maximum security prison where I spent 3.5 months as a political prisoner in Canada. My crime was protecting my First Nation from uranium mining. This is a picture of reception in that prison, where they strip you naked, bend you over a table, and give you an internal examination. It's no secret that the representation of Aboriginal adults in custody is high in federal and provincial penitentiaries. Wasn't always so, though. It wasn't always like that. In fact, up until World War II, the representation of Aboriginal inmates was lower than the per capita population. That's because a lot of Indigenous people still lived in rural areas and still depended upon traditional pursuits to provide for their food security and their shelter, even though they lived on reserve. The other thing that we take into consideration here is that the results of residential schooling really hadn't taken effect as yet. It wasn't after the Second World War that the serious destruction in social conduct and values could be really felt. But after the Second World War, the population statistics began to rise for the Aboriginal population. And they have steadily risen and continue to rise even today. So what's behind that? Well, there's been a lot of studies, a lot of theory about why Aboriginal people are running into trouble with the law. Well, the gap in socioeconomic conditions between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people has frequently been considered to be the context of that representation. Analysis of census and correctional service data from various provinces suggests that age while one of the strongest factors in criminal behavior, may not be the strongest explanation for the representation of Aboriginal people in custody. Now let's just stop and talk about age. It is a fact that younger adults between the age of 22 and 28 often, they most frequently have run-ins with the law. After that, they tend to be, their frequency begins to decline and declines through the 30s and 40s till quite a minimal amount of interaction between the law and adults. That's true in the larger culture as well. So that's important because Aboriginal people are the fastest growing population. Over half of the Aboriginal population in Canada today is under 25. And so a greater youth population would certainly mean that perhaps there's a reason for Aboriginal people having more frequent contact with the law, simply because they're a younger population. However, there's some analysis that can counter that as well. We'll look at that in just a minute. Rates of incarceration based on education and employment characteristics suggest that a lack of high school diploma and employment contribute to the representation of Aboriginal adults from age 20 to 34 that are in custody. That is, those that are coming into custody have had no job or have no present job when they were convicted, and also they don't possess a high school education. Now that's a clear understanding of statistics in that the non-Aboriginal population has a much higher graduation rate than the Aboriginal population. So it certainly could be a factor. Clearly, non-Aboriginal adults who have a high school diploma and have employment have exceedingly low rates of incarceration. Analysis of data also suggests that while education and employment may reduce an Aboriginal person's risk of incarceration, the risk for those who have the high school diploma and employment is actually higher than non-Aboriginal, than people in the non-Aboriginal population who have those as well. So there's other factors at work. We know that. Factors such as income, housing problems, problems with the criminal justice system. And perhaps that's where the rub lies, in that the criminal justice system does not necessarily deal with Indigenous people of Indigenous heritage in an equal way. So here are the statistics that illustrate the high incidence of incarceration for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal populations. You can see that the age group 20 to 24 in the Aboriginal population is far greater than the non-Aboriginal population. In fact, at almost 27 incarceration rates per 1,000 in a population, Aboriginal rate is 26 times greater than the non-Aboriginal population. It's interesting to note that the non-Aboriginal population between 25 and 34 is still slightly rising, where the Aboriginal population is beginning to decline. The factors involved in this discrepancy may be interesting to study and may reveal something about other factors that influence the criminality of both groups. However, there may be other factors that are more relevant. For instance, what happens before the age of 20? Let's look at some statistics of youth involvement with the law. With young offenders, factors such as high school diploma and employment are not quite as relevant as they are in the adult population. However, school attendance may be a significant factor. What we see here in the bottom figure, overall, Aboriginal youth are 8 times more likely to come into contact with the law in Canada than their non-Aboriginal counterparts. Non-Aboriginal young offenders in Nunavut and Northwest Territories don't even register, while provinces such as Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba and Ontario show an exceedingly high rate of Aboriginal young offenders compared to their non-Aboriginal counterparts. Two possible conclusions can be drawn from these statistics. The first is that the socioeconomic conditions of poverty that are experienced by many Aboriginal people contribute to a high degree of criminal activity on the part of Aboriginal youth. The second is that Aboriginal children are being over-policed, and that there's a policy or a process in place that identifies Aboriginal youth as troublemakers and therefore come under the scrutiny of authorities more often than their non-Aboriginal neighbors. In all likelihood, both of those factors are significant in the overall outcomes. In fact, the outcomes that are affecting Aboriginal youth can certainly be seen to carry through into young adulthood. There is also no doubt that Canadian Aboriginal policies have also contributed to the high rates of incarceration. Between 1994 and 2002, I conducted the sweat lodges in Kingston Penitentiary and visited a number of other penitentiaries in the area. When I first began, there was an older population. Almost all of the men who I dealt with in 1994 had been residents at a residential school at some time during their childhood. Many of them had experienced the kind of abuse that is renowned in those residential schools and known today. However, as time progressed, toward the year 2000, I noticed that we were having a much younger population. In fact, I could sit down with 4 men at a table at Kingston Penitentiary and ask around the table, and 3 out of the 4 would have gone through an adoption process. We'll talk more about this when we talk about social services, but that was a fact. That we're now seeing a population which is not so directly affected by residential schools, but indirectly, in that their parents did not succeed. And many of those young people whose parents were residents in residential schools ended up in foster care or placed on adoption in families that did not know how to adjust to or understand or accommodate their cultural roots, and to help them make a meaningful entry into adulthood. For too many Aboriginal men and women, incarceration confrontation with the law are all too frequent. To walk the road of Aboriginality in this country is a risky business when it comes to confrontations with the law.